Hello and welcome to Our Shakespeare, the channel where I talk about Shakespeare from my 21st century American's perspective. Today, I've got a film review for you. Today, I'll be reviewing the film The Tragedy of Macbeth, directed by Joel Coen, starring Denzel Washington and Frances McDormand. I am aware I have not done a video in quite some time. Those of you who follow my channel are aware of this. I do apologize for that. My life is busy and I've had many family and work obligations that have taken precedence over making videos. I've got several ideas for videos knocking around in my head, and I'm sure I will get to those eventually, hopefully sooner rather than later. But if you like what I'm doing, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and like the video. That will help me to know that people actually enjoy what I'm doing and are getting something out of it. I'm not doing this for money, I'm doing this because I think people get some value from it. So if that's you, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and like the video. I would really appreciate it. So before I talk about the review of the film, The Tragedy of Macbeth, I do want to share a little bit of my opinion about the play Macbeth. And whether or not this is one of my favorite plays, one of my least favorite plays by Shakespeare, kind of where it fits in my ranking and how I view it. So for a lot of people, Macbeth is their favorite of Shakespeare's plays or their favorite tragedy. And I totally get that, but that's not where I am with it. If I was to rank all of Shakespeare's plays into a top tier, a middle tier, and a bottom tier, this play would come near the bottom of the top tier or the top of the middle tier. It's one that I admire quite a bit, but I've not fallen in love with it like many people have. And maybe the reason is because it's one of Shakespeare's plays I have not acted in. I find that I don't really fall in love with a Shakespeare play until I have a chance to act in it, because then I can get a deeper appreciation for it, a deeper understanding of it. And so I've not done that with Macbeth yet, so maybe that's why it's not higher on my list. I do, however, quite admire it, even if I do not love it like I love some of the other Shakespeare's plays. I do think, though, that the play's themes of the dangers of pursuing power for power's sake is a very timeless theme in human history, but especially right now in the American experience in the beginning of the year 2022, it is a very timely theme and one that I think is definitely worth exploring right now, and so I'm glad that Joel Coen made this film for that very reason. I should also share with you, before I talk about this film, some of my thoughts about adapting Shakespeare to film. Shakespeare obviously wrote his plays for the stage, didn't even write them for the purpose of publication. And for someone to create a successful film adaptation of Shakespeare, they have to grapple with the fact that they are taking Shakespeare's intent and putting it in a different medium. Film is a very different medium from the stage. So what are some things that I would say are fairly universal in terms of creating a successful Shakespeare film adaptation? And the first thing that I would say is that the director needs to acknowledge the difference between stage and film. So for a successful adaptation of a Shakespeare play to happen on film, it has to be a film first and foremost. It can't just be like, oh, I'm doing this play but with cameras. No, you have to justify it as a film. The second thing that I think is very important is that if you're going to take Shakespeare's language and have it be heightened, the production choices in the film have to have some verisimilitude with that heightened language. In other words, the heightened language needs to make sense in the world of the film. If you've got a film that in all of its stylings is very kind of muted and realistic, then it's not going to work on film with the heightened language. And finally, I think I should say that I personally think it's totally fine to have some departures from the original script, be it cutting, rearranging, shifting characters around, even changing the language. There's a whole range of Shakespeare adaptations that are almost unrecognizable from the Shakespeare script. 10 Things I Hate About You, for example, is one that comes to mind. I think as long as the core of the adaptation aligns with the core of Shakespeare's play, I think it can be a successful adaptation. So now I want to talk about the film. And I'm going to be talking about the film in the following ways. First, I'm going to give a summary of my thoughts, just kind of big picture. Second, I'm going to talk about some of the things that I feel very positively about in a little bit more detail. Third, I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I'm a little bit critical of and kind of mixed in my reaction to. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit of interpretation of some of Joel Coen's choices. And this might get into spoiler territory at the end, so if you want to be surprised by some of the choices that Joel Coen made and some of the performances and how his adaptation works, maybe stop before the very end, but I will tell you when we get there. But first, here are my overall thoughts. Overall, I think this is an excellent adaptation. I think it's one that should be watched by fans of Shakespeare. If you like Shakespeare, you should check this film out. I think you will get a lot out of it. Also, if you are a cinephile, if you are someone who likes cinema with a capital C, I think you will get a lot out of this film, particularly in some of Joel Coen's stylistic choices. Now, I don't think that this is a general audience's film. I don't think this is going to be a film that's going to turn your average person on the streets into a Shakespeare fan or a cinephile. Okay, this is not that. But for what Joel Coen was aiming for, I think it works very well, and I think there is an audience for this. I also think, I'm recording this video a couple days before Academy Award nominations come out. I think that this film is very deserving of several awards nominations. So I'm looking forward to seeing if it's on those. And then finally, I will say that this is a film I admire quite a bit. Much like the play Macbeth, this is a film that I admire more than I enjoy. There are several Shakespeare film adaptations that I just enjoy watching. I don't know that they're better than this one, but they're films that when I watch them, I'm entertained. I think they're worth watching and I get a lot of enjoyment out of them. One example is Julie Taymor's Titus. I enjoy watching that one and have rewatched it several times. This film, I am looking forward to rewatching, but I'm looking forward to rewatching it on sort of a more academic, intellectual level, less on an enjoyment level. So, with those big picture things out of the way, let's talk about some of the specific things I really enjoyed. The first thing I'm going to point out is, the fancy pants hoity-toity big word that I used earlier, which is verisimilitude. This is a film that really justifies the use of Shakespeare's heightened language. It does not feel out of place in the least. And that's because Joel Coen, when making the film, decided to go with an expressionist style in every element of the film, or at least that's how I would classify it, is expressionist. And because of that, because of the expressionism in the set, in the lighting, in the sound effects, the language and its heightened levels feel expressionist as well, and it feels like it fits into what Joel Coen was doing with his visual and auditory landscape as well. The second thing that I loved about this film is the cinematography. It is filmed in black and white. It is filmed in 4:3 framing, so kind of the narrower, boxy framing, and I think all of that works really well. The lighting is very, is very stark, and so all of that works together to what I think are what Joel Coen is going for in what he's doing. And I'm going to talk more about what I think he's going for and how I think he achieves it later in kind of the more spoilery sections, but I think the cinematography is excellent in this film. And the next thing I want to highlight is the production design. And this goes back to, the expressionist feel of it, the set design, the production design, be it the costumes and the set, have a very kind of brutalist feeling to them. I was reminded a little bit when I was watching it, I hate to make comparisons to other films, I was reminded a little bit of some of the production design in Dune, which is a very different type of film that came out this year. But very, very interesting production design that really worked for this film as a whole. And I think a lot of this can be attributed directly to the vision of Joel Coen, who I also want to highlight as a fantastic job as a director in this film. Not only with his creative choices, who he got on board to work with him on this film, but it's just really well directed. It takes some big swings, makes some really big, bold choices with how to portray the characters and the world that Macbeth inhabits, and I really admired Joel Coen's choices here. I think they work exceedingly well. I also do want to highlight the acting. One of the things that people are talking about with this film is Denzel Washington and Frances McDormand, and rightly so. I think the acting in this film is good to excellent for all actors. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the acting in some of the mixed areas, but overall, big picture, I think the acting is good to excellent. I want to especially highlight Kathryn Hunter, who played the witches and did a really interesting job with the witches. Some really fantastic work, physically, vocally. Her presence is exceptional, and if I was creating a list of Academy Award nominations for supporting actress, she would be on my list. One thing I want to highlight is the screenplay. Now, I do have some mixed thoughts about the screenplay that I'll get into, but overall, big picture, I think this screenplay is an excellent adaptation of Shakespeare's play. It is very efficient. It is very short. I think the film is only an hour and 45 minutes long, but Macbeth is Shakespeare's shortest tragedy, so it makes sense that it could be adapted into one of these shorter film adaptations. It is efficient. It tells the story in a relatively brisk pace. It doesn't feel like there are any wasted moments, and so I really do overall commend the screenplay. And the last thing that I want to highlight as a positive, and I can't talk much about this here, I am going to talk a little bit more about it later when I get into more spoilery territory, but the way that Ross, the character of Ross, is expanded and utilized in this film is really interesting. And I can't really say more about that here without spoiling things, I think, but I do want to say that that was one thing that I found particularly interesting about this film and something that I think worked really well. But not everything is perfect. There are a couple of things I have some mixed feelings about. Neither of them are necessarily negative, but they're a little mixed. And the first thing is regarding the acting. I mentioned as a positive that the acting is across the board good to excellent, and that is absolutely the case. But I also mentioned that the film has a very expressionist feel. The world that it creates has an expressionist, kind of brutalist feel to it. And there are some characters and actors who fit right into that world that was created. And couple that come to mind are Kathryn Hunter, who I mentioned as the witches, but then also the character of Ross feels completely part of that world. But there are a couple of actors that don't feel like they fully inhabit that expressionist space. One of them is Frances McDormand, who I do think gives an excellent performance, but doesn't quite feel like she is in that world completely like some of the other characters. And then also both of the Macduffs, who again, I think give wonderful performances, but don't feel quite like they're in the same landscape that, say, the witches and Ross are. And even Denzel Washington, who he kind of straddles the line. He's kind of in the middle of that spectrum of being in that expressionist world and not quite fitting into it. So that's a very fine nitpick because overall everybody does do a wonderful job with their individual roles. And then the second thing that I will highlight is kind of a mixed thing, is related to the screenplay. I mentioned as a positive that the screenplay is efficient and that it moves well, and that is absolutely true. However, there are a couple of times where, as a fan of Shakespeare, I would have loved a little bit more from certain moments, from certain characters. And at times, the script, in favor of keeping up a brisk pace and keeping things efficient and moving along well, will forego kind of dwelling on a particular thing or really exploring somebody's justification for doing something or for getting them into that mindset. And so I feel like I could have spent easily another 15, 20 minutes in this world with this play, with this direction, with these actors, and have maybe even enjoyed it more than I did in the hour and 45 minutes that we got. So I'm about to get into some spoilery thoughts. Before I do though, I do want to give this film a grade. I'm a teacher, and so grading things is a thing that I do. And I would say that this film is a solid A. I wouldn't quite go into A+ territory just because of those kind of mixed things that I mentioned, but it is a really excellent Shakespeare film adaptation, especially if you are a fan of Shakespeare or if you are a fan of cinema as an art form. So definitely worth a watch if that's you, and I definitely expect to see it come up for some Oscar nominations in a couple of days. If I could choose, I would choose it to be a nominee for production design, cinematography, and probably actor for Denzel Washington. And I'd love to see Kathryn Hunter for supporting actress, though she's not really in the conversation as much as some other folks. And I expect that there's a strong chance that it'll get a Best Picture nomination as well. Okay, so let's get into some details, some kind of spoilery, interpretive stuff. If you want to be surprised by the film, go ahead and stop here. Thanks for watching this far. If you're interested in my thoughts, a little bit of my interpretation of things, then stick around. The first thing I want to point out is the role of Ross. I mentioned the role of Ross earlier, but I think what Joel Coen is doing with Ross is very interesting. He's been added to some scenes. He's got, I think, the most direct connection with the audience, the most overt connection with the audience of any of the other characters in the film. And the way that he is dressed is not only kind of gender neutral, because he's functionally wearing a dress, but also the costume has kind of some wing things involved in it, which is both reminiscent of the crows, or the ravens, the blackbirds that show up frequently throughout the film, but also could be reminiscent of an angel. And I find that fascinating. And kind of all of these things combined, to me, my interpretation of Ross was that he was functioning as, number one, kind of as a narrator, number two, almost like a godlike figure, and number three, almost an embodiment of fate, if you will. And I'd be really interested in rewatching this film. I've only watched it once, but if I did rewatch it, one of the things that I would really pay attention to is the role of Ross and how Joel Coen uses him to really kind of frame the overall experience, and almost kind of acting like a chorus from Greek theater. Very interesting and very worth paying attention to when you watch the film or on a rewatch. I also want to highlight two impacts that the production choices had on my experience of watching the film and interpreting, I think, what Joel Coen may have wanted us to take from those production choices. First, I think a lot of the production choices created thematically the idea that the pursuit of power for power's sake leads to a barren, desolate, and stark worldview / experience. I was reminded, and again, I hate to make comparisons to other films, but the idea of kind of the barren landscape and the crows reminded me a lot of that bit in Mad Max Fury Road, where they go to that place that clearly had once been green but was now desolate and had crows in it. And to me it felt like we were seeing Macbeth's worldview as someone who once had a very different experience of the world, but because of his pursuit of power, his desire to gain power for power's sake, his world was simply desolate and stark and, frankly, lonely and barren. Second, I want to highlight the way in which this film was filmed as it relates to Macbeth's worldview and experience beyond the pursuit of power. Something that, for me, was happening throughout the film was that the walls were closing in on Macbeth throughout the film. So, as I mentioned earlier, the film is shot in a 4:3 aspect ratio, which for much of the film served to highlight the height of things rather than the width of things. So some really effective shots of sky and tall ceilings, and I thought that was cool. But it also served to make the world of Macbeth start to feel more and more claustrophobic as time went by. So in the beginning of the film, we see Macbeth outdoors, not surrounded by walls, but he is surrounded by mist. But he is in the outdoors. But then towards the middle section of the film, most of the time we see Macbeth, maybe all the time. Again, I've only watched this once. I need to watch it again. But throughout the middle portion of the film, Macbeth is in his own home. He's surrounded by walls, but he has space, right? But then we get to the end of the film, and the very final battle between him and Macduff. They have a duel, and where they are fighting is on the wall of a castle. And not only are they on the wall of a castle, but that wall has walls beside it. And it's basically like they're fighting on a sidewalk surrounded by tall, thick walls. There's barely enough room on that for them to fight. If they take too big of a swing, they're hitting the walls. And so Macbeth, in his final moments, is so closed in with the walls in his mind and physically in his space that he's struggling to even fight for maintaining his power. And so throughout the film, not only is Macbeth kind of losing his mind as he pursues this power and seeks to maintain it, but the walls around him slowly close in, highlighted by the production design as well as that 4:3 framing. And I think it works really, really well. So those are my thoughts about the Tragedy of Macbeth. Again, I've watched it only one time. I would love to watch it again to further analyze it and to pick it apart. If you've seen it and you want to leave a comment with your thoughts below, I would love to read and reply to those. Also, if you enjoy what I'm doing, a reminder to go ahead and subscribe to the channel and like the video. But thanks so much for watching. Fare you well. I commend you to your own content.